Sibling Shenanigans, the popular parable of the prodigal son. We usually concentrate on the younger brother. Look up fool in the dictionary, and that's his picture right there beside the definition. Except that is not the point Jesus is really pitching here. Yes, Junior did blow his half of the family fortune on poker, booze, and wild women. And yes, he wonderfully woke up and returned home, humbler and wiser. He learned his lesson. The tuition was terrible, but he did survive. And yes, the portrait we're given of the story's loving father is as clear a snapshot of God as we get anywhere else in Scripture. And this passage yields numerous valuable sermons. But the audience Jesus was aiming at here was the Pharisees, they who had been tongue-clucking and finger-pointing at Jesus because he had been playing host to some of that society's undesirables and misfits. They thought it a scandal that Christ would risk contamination with them, even if they were showing an interest in the love of God on display in the person of Jesus. Those bums would never get on the guest list of the Pharisees, so they were muttering, mumbling, and shaking their heads over what they saw as Christ's carelessness. It is an answer to these spiritual snobs that Christ tells the tale of the younger brother, the loving father, and the older brother. It is the part about the older brother that Jesus intends for the Pharisees' special consumption. How do we get a good handle on this sour sibling? Let's cut to the chase. Enter Carl. Carl is courageous, careful, and consistent. He's a deacon, a selectman, and a member of the board at the bank. Married, faithful to a fault, and a father, 2 sons, both Boy Scouts. Carl coached his son's Little League teams for some 6 years. They didn't have a lot of fun, but they didn't lose much either. Someone remembers Carl laughing once. October of 1990, they think. He rarely smiles, and that may be gas when he does. If you've got a good joke to tell, save it for someone else. Carl knows to hold the line. If he gives his word, you can take that to the bank. Things will definitely not go to hell in a handbasket on his watch. Carl understands duty, responsibility, sacrifice, principles, standards. He sees himself as the gatekeeper, one who stands up for what is right. For Carl, things tend to be black and white. What's right is right, and he's on guard against wrong. As a child, Carl's home life was difficult. His father was an abusive alcoholic. Carl got his share of beatings when his father had been drinking, and he saw his mother get hers too. Carl always tried to protect his younger brother from his father's drunken rages. Sometimes his dad's paycheck got drunk up before he got home, and there was no food on the table for a while. One day his father walked out and never came back. At 15, Carl quit school to go to work. His mother needed help, and he knew it. He'd had a dream of playing baseball for his high school, and the evidence was he'd have been an outstanding ball player. But that was just another dream of Carl's that had to die. He saw to it that his brother stayed in school. When Jake would act up, Carl would go talk to the principal. Then he'd talk to Jake. Sometimes he did more than talk. On one occasion, Carl caught Jake and his friends drinking beer in the woods behind the house. The ruckus was audible for about a half a mile. Someone called the police, and Carl was warned he'd be arrested if he failed to control himself in the future. But it was Jake's last beer until his mid-20s. Carl had to be the man of the house until his mother remarried when he was 22. He got a job at the mill in town and later became a foreman. His self-discipline and work ethic served him well. When his church looked into sponsoring a chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous, Carl opposed it aggressively. He said alcoholics were shiftless weaklings and didn't deserve any help. The church council adopted plans for a homeless shelter. Carl fought that until it passed over his angry objections. He felt no one needed to be homeless. They just weren't willing to work and take responsibility for themselves. Milt Edwards applied for membership in Carl's church while Carl was on the diaconate. When Carl found out Milt was out on parole from an armed robbery conviction and a 4-year term in the prison, Carl blocked his membership until his term as deacon was done. Carl said Milt had made his bed, so let him lie in it. He thought the parole board was a bunch of do-gooders. Carl was righteous by the rules. Right was right, and nothing was more important to him. He knew responsibility when he saw it, and if others didn't, well, that wasn't his problem. Carl was religious, although not happy about it, but whoever said the two had to go together. Carl wasn't known to be very forgiving, but he figured if you lived the way you should, and he did, then you didn't need that much forgiving. Compassion was also not high on his list. If you needed that much help, you couldn't be very responsible, so you must have earned your trouble. Carl figured people didn't need breaks as long as they tried to face up to life's challenges. He certainly hadn't caught any breaks, and he survived, didn't he? Carl made no allowances for himself. Didn't need to. And he sure as heck wasn't going to make any allowances for anyone else either. Allowances were for the weak and lazy. Carl's religious faith was built on that cornerstone. You see, Carl was determined to prevent bad things from happening. He didn't have much interest in good things getting done. Carl was close enough to being a 21st century Pharisee. His days were devoted to duty's demands. His efforts, his life, was not energized, was not fueled by compassion, by mercy, by a warm heart. Those old enough and wise enough to know about his upbringing understood much of why he was the way he was. They wish they could get him to understand too. So far they haven't. They're not alone. They're in good company. Jesus taught today's parable to get the Pharisees of his day to understand, to free them. Evidence is that a couple of them did. One would have been Nicodemus, another Joseph of Arimathea, who made his tomb available for Jesus. But most of them didn't. They just hated him for it and then plotted his execution. At the end of the parable, the older brother is still outside of the house. He can hear the music, the singing, but we don't know if he ever listened to the love of his father and went in to join the party. We just have to make sure that we do.